Hey guys, Nathan here again. It's been a long time, but I'm finally back. Still on Heidegger though, I can't get away from the guy. Today I'm looking at this book, Contributions to Philosophy, and probably about an 8 or 9 episode series, this one, and hopefully a little bit shorter than the other video series that I've done. So a little bit about this book, Contributions to Philosophy, written between 1936 and 1938. It's a really good kind of big picture of Heidegger's thought here. It's the first thing of Heidegger's that I've read where he kind of lays everything out, and you can see, you get kind of like I say, that big picture feel of what he's talking about with his quest for being, to understand being. And so that's good. The downside is that of course it's Heidegger, so it's difficult to read, but it's not a book that Heidegger wrote kind of from start to finish. And it's a book, in a way, you don't even really read it from start to finish, because it's just not organized in that same way. The reason it's not organized like a normal book is because it's a collection of notes or thoughts that Heidegger had during this 2 or 3 year period. And so those notes have been taken and then kind of grouped into topics, and then the notes just slotted into those different topics. So there are about 7 or 8 chapters in here, and Heidegger's just taken notes, things that he's written down. Often they're notes to himself, so he's asking questions of himself, and he puts them in the book as that, just as, you know, as questions, unanswered questions, but things that he's pondering, things he's thinking about, related to that topic, wherever it is, whatever it might be. And so it makes it a little bit difficult to read, and it took me a while to come up with a way to actually present this. The way I've done it in the end is not just going from start to finish the way I did with, you know, being in time, being in nothingness, and every other video that I've done. Instead, I read through the whole thing, taking my own notes from different parts, and then slotting those notes into topics which more or less align with the chapter headings. But like I say, I was taking stuff from all throughout the whole book and putting it into various categories, into various topics. So I jump around a lot is the idea here. So that it's not you can't watch this video series and read through the book in the same way that you could, and that I recommended you do, with being in time and being and nothingness, and all the other videos actually. So with that said, though, like I say, it's a good overview of Heidegger's thought, and yeah, so let's get into it. So being, the first thing I wanted to, actually, before we even start, Heidegger talks about being. He spells it, he uses an old form of the word being, spelled B-E-Y-N-G here, and that's that kind of capital B, being, which is all of the other things that we've read up to this point. Heidegger's indicated with a capital B, or the translator's indicated with a capital B. In this, he uses that spelling B-E-Y-N-G, and I'll just reference that when I think it's unclear, by just adding being with a Y, and that's what I'm talking about when I use that expression, kind of that ultimate source of everything, that the reason, being as the source of beings and of the being of beings. So anytime I talk about being with a Y, It's that root event. Heidegger calls it an event in here. That root event, that the source of everything, of all beings, of all being of beings, and so on. Repeating myself again. I got to stop doing that. So let's get into it. This first video, I'm just going to run through some topics I picked up, some general ideas that struck me while I was reading the book that didn't constitute kind of a chapter in themselves. Just some small things that popped out for me. The first was, there's quite a bit of there are places in here where Heidegger's Nietzschean kind of elitism comes through, and he talks about preparing the ground for those who will come, and the questioning of beyng, with a Y, being only for the few. And that's very reminiscent of the way that Nietzsche talked, especially in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's very elitist, right? It's Heidegger's not writing for the masses. He's writing for these few people who he thinks can or are inclined to drill deeper to get to this understanding of being, with a Y. And he also criticizes the arbitrary accessibility of everything for everyone, which is something that he sees happening with things like, I guess at that time, it's in a way it's although it's not deliberately or explicitly political, that democratization. Everybody's equal. Everybody's as good as anybody else. You know that, and Heidegger's kind of resisting that notion. And not as strongly as Nietzsche was, but there's that strand here. And anyway, I just thought it's worth mentioning. He talks about worldviews and systems as well, and specifically how he's against them, and he doesn't like that. To the extent that his philosophy is a worldview or a system, I think he would dispute that. I think all existentialists disputed that. But he's against worldviews and systems because he says they aim at overcoming, encompassing, and mastering everything. And in that sense, or with that in mind, they can't question their own ground. So anytime you have a formalized, systematic structure, Hegel's would be probably the prime example here. The system of Hegel. Anytime you build this kind of edifice where you try and explain everything, you try and bring everything in to your explanation and encompass everything. In doing that, you're putting your own roots out of that. That you're making them unquestionable, because everything's brought into the system. But what's holding the system up? That's kind of what Heidegger's getting at. And so he's against that idea that you can have these worldviews, these big systems, because by definition, they're unable to question themselves. They're unable to question their own grounding. And in that sense, they've just become arbitrary. And he also thinks that a system can only appear out of kind of Cartesian mathematical thought. So this rigorous logic, which Heidegger's also against. He would consider himself unsystematic. I hesitate to say illogical, but illogical in the sense that he's breaking with those, the formal tradition of logic, and systems he thinks fall into that category. So he doesn't like them for that reason, and he thinks his philosophy is not one of these all-encompassing systems. So Heidegger also says his thought is outside this domain, and therefore by definition unsystematic. But being unsystematic doesn't make it confused or disordered. That only follows if you take system as the measuring rod, as if you gauge everything according to system. If you define system as organized, then unsystematic is by definition disorganized. But Heidegger's disputing that. He's just saying he doesn't fall into this. He doesn't try and create a system, an all-encompassing, all-explaining system. And in being unsystematic doesn't mean that he is therefore confused or disordered. He talks about philosophy, and the quote I've got is, philosophy is the immediately useless but nevertheless sovereign knowledge. And I think we've talked about this in some other videos before. Basically, Heidegger thinks philosophy addresses being itself, being with a Y. And in doing that, it's not particularly practically useful. It's not something that you can use to really to bring about any kind of change or affect anything at an ontic level, I guess you could say. But what he says is it frees us for different ways of being. So this approach, this probing, this questioning into being with a Y frees us for different ways of being. It opens up our existential horizons and lets us, in understanding human existence and being in a deeper fashion, it means we have that option. We have more options than we had before, and in particular, I think that option to be authentic, to live historically, which we'll look at in a moment. He talks about being in time as well, which was interesting. And he says that being in time wasn't a distraction, but it wasn't the presentation of an ideal or a program either. Instead, it was a purification aimed at outlining basic metaphysical positions and was a mere prelude to what comes after that, which is that deeper search for being with a Y, being itself. And that's what we're engaged in now. Basically, the title of being in time hints at Heidegger's goal there anyway. So he wanted to shift the dialectic from beings and beingness, which is beingness is basically the being of beings, or a general kind of being. And one example maybe is the way that in Being and Time we talked about things as tools, as instruments, and how they manifested in that referential totality. That's one example of the being of beings. So it's kind of like a deeper level, but it's still not where Heidegger wants to go. He wants to go one step further into being itself, this what he'll call the event, the appropriating event here. So he wanted to move the dialectic from beings and beingness to being with a Y, and from thinking to time, where time was the word Heidegger used to capture the idea of the truth of being. So we had being and time, but he wanted to switch, to reorient ourselves, and to reorient us, I should say. And we'll see how he does that. He talks about these two different starting points, and being and time is kind of like a bridge between those those two different modes of thinking, ways of questioning. So he wanted to reorient us, to shift the conversation from talking about beings and about thinking to this deeper understanding of being itself and time as the truth of being. But Being and Time, the book, was always, he says, insufficient for this task. And the reason is it was a rejection, and so always took its orientation from that which it rejected. And that's something, I mean, I just remember reading that in Kierkegaard. I think it was Either Or, I read that. And there are plenty of Kierkegaard references here too. But that was something that Kierkegaard talked about. It's a rejection, and so in being a rejection, it never gets out of whatever it is that it's rejecting. It's still stuck in that same system. I guess the word I could use. We can't get to the truth of being with a Y by building on earlier views. Instead, Heidegger says we need a projection which leaps ahead. More Kierkegaard right there. So, Being and Time, like I said, I think the way to think of it is as a bridge from this way of thinking that revolved around beings, the being of beings, and thinking itself, to looking at being with a Y, this deeper understanding, and the truth of being. So Being and Time was a bridge there. And I think it's when you read Being and Time, it does come across that way. I think that maybe there's a dead end. He follows down the route of time, the second half of Being and Time. Anyway, that's a discussion for another day. So another interesting point he brings up here is life. He talks about life being a mode of the beingness of beings. And this is a non-scientific definition of life, because Heidegger thinks science, and in this case biology, when we describe life in biological terms, destroys living beings. When we objectify living beings, what happens is they withdraw more and more from us. And that's really a theme that underlies all existentialist thought, right? And we saw it a lot in Sartre as well. When you start breaking down living things by their biology, you lose what makes them special, what makes living conscious beings. You lose what it is that makes them special and interesting. They just become scientific objects, third person objects that we can study, and the third person is all there is to know. How the circulation works, how digestion works, all of that stuff is interesting, but it overlooks what makes living beings, living conscious beings, interesting in the first place. He talks about technology here, and says that technology has destroyed nature. And what he's getting at here is not just, it's not faster machines or more efficient machines. He's when he says technology, he's talking about a kind of a way of thinking, a way of being. And the way of being is that technology is this kind of calculative approach, this economic approach, so that everything that's left in nature is now just scenic views or recreational opportunities. So everything is, in a way, monetized. Everything is approached with that mindset. What can I do with this? How can I use this? And in doing that, we pass, we miss, we go straight past what it is that's special about that being. And in a way that this is parallel to what I was just talking about with life. When you this technological way of thinking bypasses things in themselves, objects, beings as they are, and instead looks to, how can I use this being? What can I do with this being? How can I maximize this being? Something like that. So it kind of, it's a utilitarian way of looking at things, and it commodifies things. Right? It reduces things to, it reduces the being of things to commodity, a commodity. How can I best make use of this? And we lose the being itself. He also talks in relation to this about the gigantic, and he says that nature has been calculated to gigantic proportions and prepared for the masses. And gigantic here is, the quote I've got is, that whereby the quantitative is transformed into a quality of its own, into a kind of greatness, which is grounded in calculation. So gigantic is, it's the way that, it's a clever word to use here. So the quantitative, just the how much of something becomes the most important thing. So kind of an external, superficial grasp of things. How much is there? That becomes the most important thing. And so Heidegger calls it the gigantic, because this quantitative approach, this quantitative way of thinking, this technological way of thinking, becomes great, becomes all important, becomes gigantic in our thoughts about this being. So that's what he's talking about with that. When this happens, when this mode of thinking dominates, then what we have is the abandonment of beings by being with a Y. And that's just where, as I said, the beings themselves, the things themselves, lose their connection for us to being, to the source of their own existence, of their own being. They lose that connection because we cover that with our own interpretation, which is economic, which is a commodification of the thing. He talks about decision, and this was an interesting section. Decision here has nothing to do with human choice. It's not about choosing this or that. Rather, decision, and Heidegger hyphenates it, so you've got de hyphen cision, and that emphasizes the de, which means privation or separation. And when Heidegger uses the word decision, hyphenated like this, he means the sundering, which separates. And in separating, lets the open realm as the clearing for the self-concealing first become appropriated. Lots of terms there which don't make much sense unless you've really spent a lot of time with Heidegger and his thought. But essentially, decision is, he's using it as another word really for the event itself, for being itself, and the way that being brings about beings. And it does that through a sundering, a separation, and so that's how he uses the word decision. And in that, or when you understand de-cision in that way, de-cision is the grounding and creating of these beings in themselves, without this de-cision, there could be no beings to choose from in the first place. So de-cision, as Heidegger uses the word, is grounds the human ontic level kind of de-cision, that where we choose between this being or that being. De-cision for Heidegger creates the conditions under which those beings first appear as beings in themselves, as beings as such. And like I said, the passage is quite complicated, but he talks about the either-or de-cision that we're looking at here being an extreme either-or de-cision. So not between this being or that being, but between being or non-being. But being and non-being here are not to be understood as objective presence. So not to be understood as the presence of this being or the absence of that being. So we're not talking about this or that as in presence and absence of things that already exist, beings that already exist. And if we understand the question in that way, non-being then is a mode of being, with a Y. Because when we talked about annihilation and negation before, I think in What is Metaphysics, and negation is not just this intellectual not. It's not a negating of beings that already exist. It's the process by which beings first come to appear as beings. So when we understand that, then the most essential either-or de-cision turns out to be the decision between between de-cision and indifference, i.e. not deciding. And then Heidegger goes another step deeper and says actually the deepest, most essential de-cision is the event, the appropriating event, being with a Y. And this is and the reason is because this is what allows one to bring oneself before the either-or in the first place. So prior to the event, there is no either-or. We can't even conceive of an either-or concerning anything. So the essential either-or decision between de-cision or indifference is already decidedness, because here already there is belonging to the event. So the ultimate decision, the ground, the most essential decision between whether to decide or not is already a form of decidedness, because that original decision took place with the event. So it's kind of like all roads lead back to this event, this being with a Y for Heidegger. And that, by the way, that discussion is again comes right out of Kierkegaard somewhere. From either or. It comes from either or, that discussion. So interesting to see that, I think, in this book. So another good reason to read it. Negation is something that we always have to talk about with Heidegger. We talk about it a little bit later, but just as a refresher, we're not talking about sheer rejection, dismissal, disparagement, or even disintegration. Negation is not a negative force for Heidegger. It's not that intellectual negating, not. It's instead non-being constitutes an essential possession of being itself. The no is the great leap away from, in which the there, da, and Dasein is leaped into. And that's again some language that probably takes a while to wrap your head around, but essentially he's saying that we need that nothingness. Nothingness is part of the event of being with a Y. And we explained in more detail in What is Metaphysics how nothingness does this. And so if you need to double check that, that's where that is. He talks about thinking here. He separates thinking into two kinds of thinking. And the first is a questioning, which therefore presupposes a relation between the thinker and the thing being thought. So this is that subject-object level. And that's the more superficial kind of thinking. In this mode, the thinker questions the being of beings. So we're not at the deeper level here. Just the being of beings, a general understanding of, a general being. So this level of being is arrived at through beings themselves. And being with a Y, remember, we can't get to through beings themselves. So this is still a superficial way of thinking. The second type of thinking is the guideline employed by this first type of thinking. And Heidegger describes it as the horizon within which beings as such are interpreted with respect to beingness. And we've talked about this. We talked about this a lot in an earlier video, Introduction to Metaphysics, I think it was. But I'll just briefly look at it because Heidegger talks about it again here. We started with Parmenides and Heraclitus, which are Heidegger's go-to ancient philosophers. And Parmenides had this active kind of dynamic understanding of the word think or apprehend. Heraclitus had the same with logos, which was understood as a gatheredness or discourse. And then Plato, however, fixed understanding of idea as look or that which is seen. So from Plato we started drifting away from this original, authentic understanding of being with a Y. Aristotle then added reason, rationality to the mix, and then Descartes made it mathematical. So this first type of thinking, this more superficial type of thinking, which is thinking as assertion or correctness, became the guideline for the deeper kind of thinking, the second type. And this is why Western philosophy has drifted away from being with a Y. And finally here, I just want to talk about history versus historiology. So historiology is history as it's studied by historians. It's an academic subject which aims to reconstruct and understand events that occurred in the past. So it has this what we normally understand when we use the word history, but Heidegger reserves the word historiology for that. History, however, so what is history for Heidegger? I've got a few quotes I wanted to just run by you, and then we can try and suss out exactly what he means here. So the first quote is, history comes to be only in the immediate leap over the historiological. The event of appropriation is original history itself. Historical means here belonging to the essential occurrence of being with a Y itself. If the human being is to be historical, however, and if the essence of history is to be known, then the essence of the human being must become questionable above all, and being must become question-worthy, indeed question-worthy for the first time. History is we ourselves in the moment of our relation to being with a Y, and to become historical means to arise out of the essence of being, and therefore to remain belonging to the essential occurrence of the truth of being. So those are a few quotes that I've just pulled out, and I think what we can get from that is that history is something human beings are rather than something we study. It's not a subject, it's a part of the way humans exist. It's a part of our existence. And it refers to the essential occurrence of being with a Y, of being itself, of the event. And the event of appropriation which is what Heidegger calls it. We'll be using that term, by the way, a lot. Event of appropriation, and it all refers to this. It just refers to being with a Y, the way that being with a Y kind of occurs. That's all that is. So to be historical, then, because we're talking about a process, an active, dynamic process rather than a noun, is a way of being. And it's a way of being in which Dasein, being fully open to being with a Y, is open to its essential relations to beings as such and beings as a whole in an authentic and meaningful way. So essentially it's a way of living which is authentic, I think is the idea. It's a way of living which has thought about, questioned, and come to understand being with a Y, this deeper level, this reason behind, or the reason for beings as such and beings as a whole. And when we approach existence in that way, when we understand our existence in that way, that's for Heidegger called being historical. And in a way it makes sense, because I guess perhaps the way Heidegger's thinking about it is it's at that point that something starts. History begins when you have this authentic, original understanding. And by the way, that's another Kierkegaardian idea. So revealing Heidegger's sources, I guess. And the opposite then of this then will be that technological mode of existence, which in a way hasn't started living yet, hasn't become historical yet. It's still at that superficial level. It's interpreting beings through its own lens rather than this deeper understanding and appreciating this deeper connection beings have to being with a Y, the event. And so that's where I'm going to finish the first video. Hopefully that I didn't ramble too much. It's much longer than I thought it was going to be, but we'll keep going next video, keep working our way through. And thanks for listening. If you have any questions, put them up. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again.